In the last episode, I spoke about the emergency buffer doing its job. We had real life show up. 4 tires on one car, 2 tires on the other, a car service, a proper expense. Not a fun one, not an exciting one, but the important part was that it did not become debt. The buffer absorbed it, the structure held, and instead of panic, there was gratitude. Mostly gratitude to God. Gratitude that the provision was there. Gratitude that the discipline mattered. Gratitude that something which would have created pressure before could now be handled differently. But now comes the next part. Because once the buffer gets used, the question changes. Now it is not, can we handle the emergency? Now the question is, how do we rebuild calmly? Hi, I'm JP, and I think this part matters just as much as having the buffer in the first place. Because using the emergency buffer is not failure. That is what it was built for. The real discipline is learning how to rebuild it without panic, without guilt, and without turning the rebuild into a new kind of pressure. I think this is the first thing I need to remind myself. Using the buffer is not failure. It can feel uncomfortable seeing money leave the account, especially when you worked hard to build it. There is a part of you that wants the buffer to stay untouched forever, because untouched feels safe. Untouched feels strong. Untouched feels like progress. But that is not really the purpose of a buffer. The purpose of a buffer is not to sit there untouched as a trophy. The purpose is to protect the household when life happens. And life did happen. The cars needed tires. One needed a service. The money had to be spent. So the buffer did exactly what it was supposed to do. That means the system worked. It did not fail. It protected us. And I think that matters, because if I see using the buffer as failure, then I'll rebuild from anxiety. But if I see it as the buffer doing its job, then I can rebuild from gratitude. That is a very different posture. The strongest feeling for me is still gratitude. Not urgency first, not panic first. Gratitude. Gratitude that the buffer was there when we needed it. Gratitude that the emergency did not become a loan. Gratitude that the situation could be handled when it needed to be handled. And I think gratitude needs to come before the rebuild plan. Because if I skip gratitude and go straight into pressure, I miss the lesson. The lesson is not just, now we need to refill the account. The lesson is, God provided, the structure held, and the household was protected. That deserves to be noticed. Then, after gratitude, structure can come in. Not frantic structure, not emotional overcorrection, just steady structure. The kind that says, this worked, now let's rebuild it properly. After a buffer gets used, there can be a temptation to rebuild it too aggressively, to panic, to cut everything, to squeeze the budget too hard, to treat the reduced buffer like an emergency of its own. I understand that feeling, because once you've experienced the peace of having a buffer, seeing it drop can feel uncomfortable. You want that protection back quickly. You want the account to look safe again. You want the margin restored. But rebuilding too aggressively can create a different problem. It can make normal life feel tight again. It can remove breathing room. It can turn a wise rebuild into a stressful one, and that is not the goal. The goal is not to punish ourselves because the buffer got used. The goal is to restore it steadily. Because if the rebuild creates unnecessary pressure, then I'm rebuilding the money while damaging the peace, and that does not make sense. I think the better way to see it is this. Rebuilding the buffer is part of the system. It is not a separate crisis. It is not a surprise. It is not something going wrong. It is simply the next stage. Build the buffer. Use the buffer when a real need comes. Rebuild the buffer. That is the cycle. And if I accept that cycle, I don't have to panic every time the buffer gets touched. It becomes normal. Not fun, not casual, but normal. Because life will keep happening. Cars will need maintenance. Appliances will break. Medical costs may come. Unexpected things will show up. That is not failure. That is life. The buffer exists because life does that. And rebuilding it afterward is how the system stays healthy. Now, rebuilding calmly does not mean rebuilding casually. That is important. I don't want to use the buffer and then act like nothing needs to change. There still has to be discipline. There still has to be a plan. There still has to be a decision to prioritize restoring the protection. But calm discipline is different from panic discipline. Panic discipline says, we have to fix this immediately or we're unsafe. Calm discipline says, this matters, so we are going to restore it steadily. Panic makes everything urgent. Calm structure makes things consistent. And consistency is usually what rebuilds better. So for me, the question is not, how fast can we refill this at any cost? The question is, what steady plan restores the buffer without destabilizing the rest of the household? This part matters to me. The emergency buffer exists to protect the household. So rebuilding it should not create unnecessary strain in the household. That would defeat the point. If rebuilding the buffer means every month becomes tense again, then I need to rethink the pace. If it means there is no breathing room, no flexibility, and no peace, then the plan may be too aggressive. Because the goal is not only a number in an account. The goal is stability. The goal is peace. The goal is being able to handle life without constantly living at the edge. So yes, the buffer must be rebuilt. But it must be rebuilt in a way that still respects the life it is meant to protect. That is stewardship. Not just saving money, managing the whole system wisely. This situation has reminded me that progress is not always a straight line upward. Sometimes progress looks like building something, using it, and then rebuilding it again. That can feel frustrating if I only want the numbers to keep growing. But real life does not work like a perfect chart. Real life has withdrawals. Real life has repairs. Real life has unexpected costs. Real life tests the systems you build. And when the system works, the number may go down, but the household does not go backward into debt. That is still progress. The account may be lower than before, but the family is protected. The cars are handled. The debt did not increase. The stress did not take over. That is progress too. Quiet progress. Practical progress. The kind that does not always look exciting, but changes how life feels. The last thing I need to remember is simple. The buffer can be built again. We built it once. We can rebuild it. Not because it will be instant, not because it will be effortless, but because the structure that built it the first time still exists. The habits still exist. The discipline still exists. The priorities still exist. And God's provision has not disappeared just because the buffer was used. That matters. Because when money leaves the buffer, it is easy to focus only on what went down. But I also need to remember what stayed. The system stayed. The discipline stayed. The reason stayed. The ability to rebuild stayed. So I do not need to panic. I need to return to the process. Using the emergency buffer is not failure. It is the reason the buffer exists. And when it does its job, the right response is not panic. It is gratitude first, then structure. I'm grateful that the money was there. Grateful that the expense did not become debt. Grateful that my family was protected from extra pressure. And now the next step is simple. Rebuild calmly. Rebuild steadily. Rebuild without guilt. Rebuild without turning the solution into a new source of stress. Because financial structure is not only about building a buffer once, it is about learning how to use it when life happens, and then restore it with wisdom. That is the rhythm. Build, protect, rebuild. And if we can keep doing that, then even when life gets expensive, the journey does not have to go backward. I'm JP, and I'll see you in the next one.